Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and welcome back to my Raid Retrospective series. We've been going back and looking over the old raids to see if maybe we can learn something from the old raids that can be modernized and put into the new raids. It's also been a good time to just go back and look at things that they really did well way back when, things we probably didn't give them credit for all those years ago, and also the things they didn't do so well. We've already covered the first two tiers of the binding coil, so let's get into the final coils of Bahamut. Before we get started, the sponsor of this video is Magic Spoon. They make high-protein cereal, snack bars, and granola, and we've been working with them for quite some time. It all tastes great, and honestly, it helps me when my snackometer is going off. And yeah, I get a little snacky. I've been eating their products for years now, and I get excited every time a new box pops up. This latest one came packed with some delicious treat bars and some scrumptious granola. I'm always glad to have a high-protein option around, whether it be right after I get back from the gym, or honestly, sometimes I just want to avoid traditional snacks. If you'd like to try Magic Spoon while also supporting the channel, then click the link below to get some today. Build your own custom box of products with tons of available flavors to match your daily needs. Best of all, use my link and discount code Mr. Happy to get $5 off of your box. You can also buy it at your local grocery store, even on Amazon if you prefer. And if you don't like it, Magic Spoon has a 100% happiness guarantee. Let them know and they'll refund you, no questions asked. So click the link below or scan the QR code on the screen and use code Mr. Happy to get $5 off, or go to magicspoon.com/Mr. Happy to save $5 on your order. It even works in Canada and the UK. Thanks again to Magic Spoon for sponsoring, and now back to the video. So the final coils was a pretty tough follow-up because it had to not only follow up second coil, but it also had to follow up second coil savage. And this made for a pretty interesting dynamic. Final coil was the first tier that followed a really big jump in player skill. Arguably, it already would have been a big jump from second coil, but second coil savage pushed things to a level that no player in the game had experienced yet. As such, Final Coil was actually kind of harped on when it first came out. It took 5 days for the raid to be defeated, which by modern standards sounds like it would be way harder than what we currently have. But realistically, our skill level still wasn't that great, but it was significantly higher than it had been in the previous tiers, with the first coil taking 2 months due to the added latency and problems dealing with Twister during the Twintania encounter and its many bugs and shutdowns, and then the very difficult second coils where Nail took 2 weeks, arguably not because of gear either, and also because of skill level. But after second coil savage, final coil, it just never stood a chance, especially for those top teams. But that doesn't mean the fights weren't good, so let's jump into the first fight, in that of Amjugud. Turn 10 and its very funnily named boss is actually a fight that I've always looked back on very fondly. Not for any particular mechanic, but for the way the fight is constructed and for its unique enrage mechanism that is honestly one of the most underutilized things that the Square team has ever done. It's created a scenario where this fight is unique to every other fight in the game, which is an absolutely wild thing to consider that they've never looked back on this idea and done it again. The big thing here is that the arena gradually shrinks as you approach the end of the fight. So the mechanics get harder and harder, they add layers on top of them with every phase, and your space also becomes more and more limited. It made for a really cool prog experience because even the same mechanic had to be progged differently the later and later you went, with people being more and more careful about their spread positions and how they actually reached where they needed to go for any particular mechanic. The important thing is that the arena change was not based on health or phase, just the amount of time that you were present in the fight. Normally this can actually cause a lot of issues, but for here, it just made it so that the initial prog experience was very rewarding and you still had to race that initial clock. But faster kills were just allowing for the same mechanics to be done with more space on the arena, which doesn't fundamentally change the fight all that much and is kind of a really rewarding way for the player to see that they're actually getting stronger or playing better. Even when you're progging, going from seeing, oh, we're at this percentage with the wall like this, or oh wow, now we're at this percentage with the wall like that, is a really nice way of indicating a jump in player comfortability and skill. The wall is also not instantly lethal, so it's technically possible to clear after the entire arena has closed, which did definitely happen to some teams back in the final coil and makes for a really, really cool final kill experience. The fight design is what I consider a builder design as well, which I think is the best type of fight, in that all mechanics persist through all the phases and gradually grow more dangerous, especially when combined with other attacks. There's also an add phase where the boss's damage escalates the longer that it takes. A common thing back then, but they really don't do that now. Now they just want you to kill the adds before the phase ends, and the damage is always going to be the same. I understand why they do it that way. It's kind of annoying to prog through a phase, successfully get through it, but you took too long and now everything is wiped out. But that extra onus and pressure of meeting a DPS check, that's just another way of expressing it. I mean, realistically, they expect you to probably die at a certain number of stacks. So why not just be able to do the mechanics of the phase, even if you've technically run out of time and will die at the end of it? It allows for a better prog experience, in my opinion. Another thing they could probably go back to doing in a somewhat more limited capacity, maybe not as big of a damage jump, but if they have an intended amount of stacks that is probably going to be too lethal for you, and design around that, it kind of creates the same thing without presenting it the same way. So, in my opinion, Amjagud is a largely underrated first-tier boss for its concepts alone. Its mechanics were really cool for the time, where it does this kind of grand debuff thing. One of the first times we really saw like a grand debuff management session, where he has a pretty quick cast bar. He tethers one person, some people have to spread, and he keeps adding mechanics to that section right there. The positioning of players as they get knocked back, because this was the first place that we actually had the wild charge mechanic. Yeah, you know how people refer to an AoE, like a line AoE or something, where the tank needs to stand in front? You know how they refer to it as a wild charge? It is because of Amjagud. That is where that term was phrased a decade ago. That term was phrased. You know what I mean. That phrase was termed. Either way, yeah, Amjagud is the originator of that. So, like I said, this fight, it's crazy to me how when people think of old fights that are really cool, Amjagud just never comes up, when it is a wholly unique and iconic encounter throughout the ages that we've never seen anything like again. Not in Criterion, not in Savage, Chaotic, doesn't matter. We've never had a boss like this again. So I really would love them to revisit a lot of the ideas that Amjagud does, and if I'm being honest, this is actually one of my highest rated fights in all of the Binding Coils, up there with the Avatar, even though the Avatar is more executionally cool, but also very well designed, and a builder style fight as well. So there's a reason why that one's ahead. But yeah, Amjagud, I'm sorry, you just don't get the appreciation that you should enjoy, and we should really learn something from this first fight. Speaking of fights that are iconic that don't really get the credit that they're due, turn 11 is against Kalia, which is a boss that is still very regularly referenced. Some of its mechanics are just really standard stuff that we see nowadays, and we kind of don't appreciate, unless you were there back in the Realm Reborn, that Kalia is the originating point. So you'll obviously recognize this Hydra-style model, and you'll immediately recognize the nerve gas mechanic, which is the 3 AoEs, one that's like the back right half of the boss, one that's the back left, and one that's the front. I mean, we see that non-stop nowadays. They do it with other types of models now too. This is the originator of that nerve gas mechanic. Heck, we even saw a Kalia clone when we were doing Eureka Orthos on the higher floors. One of the harder fights up there as well. But it's also a very well-constructed sort of builder-style fight. So the first phase is a basics check. It teaches you how to do the tank buster and how all of their, very simple attacks are. You can watch the heads firing to see if it's stack or spread first with the marker over the person's head. There's a buster where the boss stuns a player and then casts another skill, and then you have to do the swap during the second cast bar, so you can't swap too early, you can't just swap as soon as the tank gets stunned. Got to make sure you're paying careful attention. It's got a frontal cleave that splits damage between the tanks, which we do see, attacks that split damage between the tanks still, but it's less. We saw it in P8S, for example, where it was basically lethal outside of invulns if you didn't have both tanks stacked together. There was also the multiple large AoEs that you've seen boss using with things like nerve gas, and then it did things like disabling the ability to run through the boss ring. This was one of the first times we ever saw that. There's a barrow field in there. It's not lethal immediately, but it gives you a vuln, it gives you a heavy, and it is most likely to kill you with the damage that it deals. So it forced people to rotate around the boss to deal with all of those AoEs, which again was just a new experience back then, but something we've seen plenty of since then. The ad phase is also iconic. 2 ads that the party splits up to kill, and a lone ad that rotates on its own while everyone deals with every mechanic coming out at once. Almost any modern boss that does something even remotely similar to this is regularly referred to as a Kalia reference. Heck, even the M8S ad phase, which is 2 ads and the 2 orbs, my team immediately went, oh, it's like Kalia, because basically there's some sort of object on the arena that is dictating the direction that you need to rotate, which then you have to position for the mechanics relative to that rotation, the rotational direction. So yeah, but we've seen that. I mean, even Birdnado back in Shadowbringers, everyone called that a Kalia phase if they were around from A Realm Reborn. But this is something that we do love seeing. The only issue with Kalias in particular, something they won't go back to, is that one had to be physically attacked in order to kill it in a reasonable time, and the other magically attacked. They were really trying to force the balance through ways like that back then. I mean, we had all the physical vulns and stuff like that with, slashing, piercing, and blunt, but that was really the only issue, and that's not something I think they'll ever revisit, because as much as they kind of want a balanced party, I don't think they want to force it to that capacity where they say, no, you absolutely need magic damage dealers, you absolutely need physical damage dealers. So it's a bit restricting on party comp. That's like the one negative thing. But the ad phase itself, like I said, iconic. Line AoEs, people being marked with debuffs they needed to walk out of the group with, making sure to kill the ads kind of close together at the same time. And then being able to deal with all the mechanics at once on the final ad as it did its own rotation. Yeah, like I said, just really, really good ad phase. And the last phase is actually one of the first times we saw near and far tethers. We had seen the vines in Rafflesia, which was the first time we had seen that. But near far tethers weren't really a thing at this point. And so when Kalia did them, it took a lot of adjustment. Players just didn't really... There wasn't enough of a player understanding, and the trust between individual players on a team really had to grow from this. We've obviously gotten to the point where people kind of have such a distinct game plan nowadays that there's a lot less trust and a lot more automation. Back then, that just wasn't how players were thinking. The boss would tether players to each other, but they have to do all the phase 1 mechanics, rotating around the nerve gas, the tank busters, everything, without moving incorrectly. Basically, if 2 people went in the opposite direction, it was almost going to guarantee that a tether was broken in some capacity. Not an instant wipe, mind you. Those tethers would only kill those 2 players, but when you're racing in Rage and trying to make sure you have enough people for a stack, and you're trying to make sure both the tanks survive in a very, very important section with things like tank busters and the boss having a frontal cleave that does a lot of damage, yeah, it became a lot of the times unsalvageable if any of those tethers broke. And it's a really long tether dance too. It's like 45 seconds, and then you don't have it for a little bit, and then you get new ones, and then you have to readjust. The spread and stack while having the near tether, with the near players need to spread, but the near tether breaks very easily. Yeah, there is a lot of little nuance that went into that. So Kalia, again, really improved player skill and has a lot of elements to it that we just see very regularly nowadays. But that's the originator, and again, a boss that deserves a lot of credit. And as if Final Coil needed any more heavy hitters, Final Coil is the home of the Phoenix encounter. Now, not the Phoenix encounter that we had in Pandemonium, but this is the original. The thing that the Phoenix counter was basically a rehash of. And in my opinion, even to this day, the Phoenix fight did everything the Phoenix fight did, but better. Yeah, it's crazy. Sometimes the older ideas are the better ideas. It's one of the best third fights the game has ever released. It's a careful balancing act that heavily relies on a lot of micro positions for different mechanics that gradually begin to compound and change over the fight. Most of these elements are used in the Phoenix fight, so they're going to sound familiar, but you'll see how they're different pretty quickly. So phase 1, there's not really a whole lot going on there. The big mechanic is that there's seeds that need to be dropped on the ground and killed. They can't be stacked, you know, obviously same as Phoenix. But there's an interesting thing. So you would drop them near the boss, drop white flames on them to give them the vuln up, and then kill them before they effectively exploded. Now, a funny thing about these seeds is that the vuln up would increase your damage dealt to them. Dots were a much more common part of gameplay back then, and Summoner was a dot job back then. So what players figured out they could do is they could snapshot dots onto a seed and then bane them onto the boss and increase the speed at which they killed the boss. So having a summoner became damn near mandatory for those prog groups because abusing that was great for beating the week 1 DPS check. One of those teams did report that it was a function to Square. They wanted to know if it was intended or not, and Square actually had to fundamentally change the way that dots were programmed with vulns to stop this from happening in the future. So they did end up changing it so that baning off of the target would not snapshot that same level of damage onto the other target, which meant that, that just fundamentally changed it. The fact that Bane would no longer spread the boosted dots and would instead re-snapshot on the other target with its base potencies, and any of the damage buffs the summoner themselves actually had, and any debuffs the other target had. You know, it just wouldn't factor in things that the first target had and then transfer them to the second target. It fundamentally changed that. So it's a fun little like history tidbit when it came to Phoenix. There was also a blue and red flame mechanic where players would drop a giant blue flame puddle somewhere, and then another player would get a red flame, and they'd have to kite the red fire over the blue without touching any other players or letting the orb touch them. There were definitely some kerfuffles that happened over that. I definitely remember a handful of them, and it was pretty funny. But it was a pretty basic mechanic, but a lot of players had issues with avoiding the orb and maintaining their position on the boss. Another big thing is the ads. The ads in this phase were very, very well done. Very engaging. The ad starts spawning in the second phase, the Benus. And when you kill it in a spot, its body stays there. And then you have to do that for each ad that spawns, and you want to position them in a different spot from each other. And that ends up mattering at a later mechanic. But I really like something that we used to do with old raids that we don't really do nowadays, is that something we do in an earlier phase very rarely affects something we do in a later phase now. That is true of the ad phase with Omjigud. That's true here with the Benus being defeated. Most of the time, if they want to do an ad phase, it's very much contained to within the ad phase. So looking at Phoenix, for example, you don't place Benus around the map before the ad phase begins. The Benus come out, and then you just want to kill them separated from each other so that their circles don't overlap. That's fine, but you know, you're doing that all within the one contained ad phase. This is the equivalent of doing the positioning before the ad phase and then finding out if you need to adjust it later. I really like when fights do that. It gives the fight sort of like a continuity that we just don't really get anymore. And that was here, so it was great. But before even talking about the ad phase, one last thing is the brand mechanic, which was actually a hilarious mechanic that also had to adjust the way that the devs thought of things. It marks a player with a brand, and the Phoenix later tries to blow up that player. If the player is branded and they get hit by the follow-up attack, Flames of Unforgiveness, then they will die. So while Flames of Unforgiveness is being cast, the brand target needs to swap the brand to another player. They can't swap it beforehand, or the boss will just target the new branded player when Flames of Unforgiveness starts casting. Touching another player passes the brand, also does a ton of damage, so you have to be careful about when you do it and who you're doing it to. And then the brand player will also take an AoE from the Flames of Unforgiveness. So you basically had to position the brand player as kind of like a danger section, but you need to keep someone really close nearby, and you needed to get the healing on point because they were both going to take damage from the brand pass, and then the follow-up player was going to take the damage from Flames. Now, the thing that the dev team had to learn is that they didn't really know how to scale damage for 1 to 2 players. So there's actually 2 brands. The initial brand that goes out, I believe, is like a red brand. I'm colorblind, so work with me here. And then after you pass it, it becomes a blue brand. And players just didn't know why that was the case. We just were like, oh, I guess it's a different color now, but you know, we're just doing the mechanic the same and it's working. Everyone would just mitt the player with the brand and then make sure that they survived it. Turned out, we found out, I think from a guide that was like written online by like Square. It was in like a book they published or something like that. I don't remember, or in a Japanese interview. That the blue brand is actually a split damage AoE. It's actually a 2-player stack. So what you were intended to do was pass the brand to the second player, so as you're supposed to during Flames of Unforgiveness, and then they were supposed to stand close to another player to split the damage, and you had to do that every other brand. But the players didn't do that. We just threw a Loquium and Stone Skin on the player who was going to get the big brand explosion, and just powered through it. Now, I say they needed to learn the lesson, but they really haven't. To this day, we still have spread AoEs or pair AoEs that are survivable with mitigation. I will say that nowadays they are regularly more lethal, and we actually have to put a lot of concentrated effort into saving those players if you want to prevent them from dying if they don't have a partner. I've seen this in as recent as M7S, where there are pair AoEs during the second platform, and people will super mit through it so they don't have to actually stack the players, and you know, they just can make sure that that's not such a crucial part of doing it successfully, especially because sometimes you just go into that last seed drop with only 7 people alive. So yeah, it's something they haven't fully learned, but back then, I mean, it was like 1 shield and a Stone Skin, which technically is 2 shields, but like it was like a bare minimum effort to save that person. So much so we couldn't even tell that it was a pair AoE. It wasn't marked, it was just a different color. We had to figure out that it was that's what it was doing. So yeah, it's a very interesting part of this fight's history as well. Now, once you've got those elements down, the ad phase is really the big thing here. Each Phoenix ad killed in the first phase resurrects and empowers any other nearby ads by giving them bonus HP. The boss flies north and begins pulsing raid-wide every 20 seconds or so, Flames of Rebirth. And every time it does that, it gains a stacking buff, so the next Flames of Rebirth will hit harder. And you're obviously, racing the clock to kill all of the ads before Flames of Rebirth becomes lethal to the entire team. However, Flames of Rebirth resurrects any of those ads up to 2 times. The first time it resurrects them is when the phase begins, so that'll be the very first cast as the Flames of Rebirth. And then, after you kill them once, it will resurrect them a second time, and then killing them the second time will permanently kill them. So basically, you kill an ad, and then move the pack of ads away from that first dead ad. Then wait for the first one to resurrect. Now you can kill that ad, and then kill another small one, and rotate around the room and do that. So you're both kind of pacing the phase based on how many ads you have, because you can actually have more or less ads depending on how quickly you did the second phase right before this. But you're also kind of racing like a bunch of mini DPS checks to try to stop as many Flames of Rebirth as possible. Ideally, you can kill a big one and a small one in one cycle and not treat them all as an individual cycle. And if you miss any of those cycles, then the threat of the fight just kind of escalates and escalates. It's a really cool way of doing a phase like this, as opposed to something like Phoenix, where it's just, oh, if they're too close together, you die. You know, that's it. Like, this is technically savable if you do make a mistake. If like an ad empowers another ad, it just gives it more health. So if you burst it down, you technically can still, you know, keep pace, or at least make up the time that you would have lost. So again, it's like there's a lot of skill expression from the previous phase and from this phase, and player kind of skill ceiling. You can see it raising as you actually progress through and as you get more gear. So yeah, it's just again really well done, way better done than the Phoenix one in my opinion. And the Phoenix one isn't even really that bad. And then the last phase, I love. It's just full-blown chaos. There's still the brands, but now the boss drops fountains of fire. Of course, you recognize these from Phoenix. Similar idea, you have to stop them from pulsing onto the boss by standing in the puddle itself. But here, it's just every time the puddle pulses, it gives the player a stacking debuff that makes them take more damage from Fountain of Fire. So, you know, a tank can usually take 3 before it becomes a little overwhelming, and most other players can take 1 or 2. So you basically have to alternate who's in the Fountain of Fire while doing the brand passing, while doing the usual tank busters, and also another new mechanic. There's just birds tethering to people and dashing through the arena, and it hits everyone in its path. So players have to try to aim these AoEs in such a way that it doesn't threaten other players. They may need to eat a fountain AoE while they have it, and every other player needs to be aware of that and step out of the way. And then there's a point where the Phoenix just jumps up into the air and just lets a bunch of Phoenixes go loose with fire AoEs on the ground. And again, you're just trying to make sure you don't overlap any of them because you don't want to deal too much damage to anyone. And it's just a really fun and chaotic fight that makes for a really great way for the end of the fight to escalate. Another thing is that the Fountain of Fire adds stacks of the same buff from the ad phase where it was casting Flames of Rebirth, and the boss will also cast Flames of Rebirth periodically throughout the phase in order to give itself damage buffs for that same phase. So the hard enrage of this fight is actually still only a soft enrage. basically, there's like, I think 4 or 5 Flames of Rebirth before you get to Enrage usually. And at Enrage, the boss just spams it over and over again. They'll cast Flames of Rebirth, then cast it again. And it's like, I mean, like they actually do the cast bar over and over again too. And the damage just escalates and gets higher and higher and higher. So the less Fountains of Fire you failed, or the more you did successful, I should say, the more time you have during that end sequence, theoretically. And the easier it is to heal through the normal sequence of Flames of Rebirth, which is already getting stronger and stronger. You could also, in theory, if you knew you could kill the boss, abandon the Fountain of Fire altogether for like the very, very end, like the last few percent, and then kind of just Zerg the boss to limit player movement, to limit the worry of having to deal with the damage intake. The healers can do more GCDs, which was starting to become a more normal thing during this tier as well, thanks to second Coil Savage. So yeah, it was a really, really well done fight, and I still don't think a lot of fights, even the fight that is designed to be an homage to this fight, doesn't achieve the same feeling of progressing this fight and its originality. It's just the modern version. It's scary because Phoenix is an example of what if they took some of those old ideas and modernized them. And I want to be clear, Phoenix is not a bad fight. I think people give it a lot of problems because it's really orange. You know, I'm colorblind, not a problem for me, but you know. But mechanically speaking, it's really sound. Like, I can't stress enough that they actually did a really good job. No matter how bad your PFs were with Phoenix, they did a really good job at that fight. But it is clear that modernizing the Phoenix mechanics took away a lot of what made Phoenix unique. So if they do modernize any of these ideas and use them again, they have to be more careful, in my opinion. We really want unique experiences like we've actually gotten in the most recent tier. So I don't want them to jump back too far, or not jump back far enough even, and you know, just try to play it too safe. And that's a good example of them doing that with Phoenix. And finally, we come to the big kahuna himself, Bahamut, the original final boss. Oh, the binding coil of Bahamut. Who will the final boss be? Well, it can't be Bahamut. He's too big. Ah, here you go. Bahamut Prime. Of course it had to be Bahamut. A dramatic and deadly boss that, while regarded as less difficult than Turn 9, also because of the player jump from second Coil Savage, still left its stamp on the players in a number of ways. It does a really good job of using mechanics from throughout all of the binding coil, and that's something that they have done in other tiers. I'm glad to see that's something that they have done. It's been on and off, and there's always been reiterations of it. Great example would be E12 against Eden's Promise. The uses all of the different, you know, it uses all of the elementals and stuff, all of the different primal fights. So really, really good stuff. But this was the first case where we saw that, and it was really heartwarming and heart-wrenching. I mean, you've got Answers playing in the back. You've got this big dragon who hits really hard. Like, he would hit monstrously hard, even for back then. And it was a long, long fight with a lot of uptime. Resources were really, really hard to maintain during that. And it was great. Even if it didn't get as much credit as Nail, I still think it's a fantastic final boss fight. The first phase is pretty simple. It's mostly just tank busters, mega flares, and tethers. The tank busters were way more threatening here, mostly due to their frequency. He would be like flare breath, flatten, flare breath, and then be like later be like flare breath, flare breath, flare breath, flatten. Like the frequency of the tank busters in UCOP is not that far off of the frequency of tank busters that we had here. Not to mention his autos just hit really hard. Mega Flare was also really interesting because it was a solid mix of spread and stack mechanics, with like several different spreads being delayed, followed by players being marked with a stack, so the spread into the stack being a really important thing, plus the overlapping of players getting spreads and then being in the stacks, and then some players not, meaning that spot healers were really, really well appreciated during this. And then eventually we had Earthshakers, which was something they would reuse later, although never quite in the same way. Players would get tethered and then blasted with the line AoE 3 times in a row. And also here it would leave a puddle behind. It's kind of strange because leaving the puddle behind was something I was initially really excited about way back when. I was like, oh, yo, I bet in the final phase they're gonna just make it so that the puddles just never go away, because during the early phases they do go away, and I was like, oh, they're gonna keep accumulating and the arena is gonna get smaller and smaller. I think that was just me having played too much WoW before that, because like WoW does that with like every final boss. They like always do like, oh, the players drop an AoE, or the players bait an AoE, or like there's some sort of puddle that's getting bigger and now the arena's like, that's like WoW 101 when it comes to raid design. I expected it here. Now I will say this, we don't ever do that, and Amjagud is the only time we've ever done that. So again, an idea they should revisit, but back then I remember being disappointed that the Earthshakers didn't do that. Now, speaking of Mega Flare, when you go into the second phase, which is where a whole bunch more things start happening, Mega Flare actually does a new mechanic. It does the Mega Flare Tower. Yeah, you know those towers that you need a player to stand in? That's where they began, is right there in the Mega Flare mechanic. So we have another originator, and it was really funny because in Heaven's Ward, in the Aetherochemical Research Facility, they basically threw a bunch of coil mechanics in there in a dungeon format to get players used to seeing them, so they could, you know, actually use them in more endgame raid fights or trial fights without people, you know, who didn't do it, just kind of not, you know, not doing that. But it's funny that this was the first time there's Mega Flare. Yeah, they ended up doing an Aetherochemical Research Facility, and players didn't know what to do. They threw a tower down, and only players who did Coil knew, okay, we need to stand in that tower. Thank you, second boss of ARF. The second phase also has adds that tether to the boss if they're too nearby. This is not an uncommon thing at this point, so players figured that out pretty quick, but it made for some really interesting boss positioning. It made it so that positioning the boss south on pull was actually a really important thing. Players really do have it ingrained in their head to pull the boss face at north. But there's a lot of times where even in the current day, we really should be just pulling a boss south and holding it there to start. It pulls it towards your melees. They can just swing around. They don't need to worry about gap closing as much or getting that initial distance or worrying about the exact range and all that. And sometimes it's better for positioning. In this case, doing that in phase 1 meant that Bahamut was already separated from the first ad that spawned in phase 2. So it came with a really good example and was really good at teaching players that sometimes the answer is not to just pull it and center it and face it north. Nowadays we do that because the bosses jump center every time anyway. But we do have some cases where, you know, we may need to pull bosses a little bit differently sometimes, and, you know, just depends. DSR had to do it, and there was that. That was just made for a little bit better of an opening phase. Other than that, there's like orbs that put a stacking debuff on players, so you need to kind of make sure as many different players as orbs as possible, because having any more than one stack as a non-tank was lethal pretty much, and how you could probably have 2 stacks as a tank, but that was about it. But it was a pretty simple phase overall. Bursting down the ads before they became a problem, they had incredibly hard-hitting tank busters, and they would enrage, so yeah, that was probably the most stressful thing about the second phase. The third phase is a giant downtime ad phase. It's got a mix of different dragon mobs from all over the course of A Realm Reborn, each with their own mechanics. It's like a mix of the turn 4 ad spawning as well as Twintania, and even some new mechanics like the Mega Flare dive bomb, which, you know, it's basically Twins dive bomb, but now there's a Mega Flare. We got to spread and then get to the towers and the stack marker and everything at the same time. So really well done. Heck, there's even a mini Twintania that drops a Neurolink. Like, you know, all those elements are here. And again, really enjoy seeing them kind of build on things that you've already seen throughout the rest of Coil and throughout that expansion so far. The final phase is kind of just a more dangerous version of the first phase. I actually kind of appreciate when they do that nowadays, or whenever they do that, because I really like when fights have that kind of, again, builder structure, that continuity of the fight. It's got Mega Flare, the towers, the Earthshakers, but it's got a couple of mechanics that definitely left an impression. Of course, it has Akmorn, one of the most iconic tank busters in the game, the split damage tank buster that blasts over and over again and just keeps adding numbers every single time. Yeah, this is where the Akmorns begin. And yeah, that was really cool. So that's a thing to note. But it also had these twister tethers. Basically, there would be 2 tethers that would hit that player with an AoE. Any player could survive it. It wasn't really that much damage. It was like an irregular spread AoE worth of damage. But any player too close to them would get flung into the wall because it would form a twister around that player. So even just having the twisters there was kind of like a reference back to Twintania as well, because we had twisters. This is a different kind, and it had very similar reactions to getting flung into the wall by being a little too close. And there were lots of ways to handle them too, because the tanks could take them during some mechanics, and then some players could just eat them if they had them during other mechanics like Earthshakers. So they made for some more interesting positioning. But again, the Earthshakers not sticking around just meant you had so much space to do all of Bahamut's mechanics that I felt like the arena was almost too big for Bahamut during this phase in particular. During the first phase, it's not that big a deal because you're just getting started. But during the second phase, man, you literally have, like, you only need about half the arena to do every mechanic, which is pretty wild. You know what I mean? To think that this final phase basically just uses a small pocket of wherever you've decided to tank them. But, I mean, this is kind of why it was a fight that didn't get as much, I guess, love as Nail, as iconic as it was, because Nail was very executionally heavy. There was a lot of, like, placing elements during all the phases, and positioning with the dive bombs, and with the jump into the air, and with the spread AoEs. There's a lot of elements that just were constantly moving. Bahamut was a sheer matter of an unstoppable force against an immovable object, and you're supposed to be the immovable object, but Bahamut's a really strong unstoppable force. And so they went for that kind of idea, and it works really well, but it just got criticized a lot back then. So it's unfortunate to see. It wasn't a bad fight by any measure. I don't think it shines nearly as big as the other pieces of the tier, you know, Kalia, Amjagud, and Phoenix. I feel like they all had way better kind of themes, and they captured imagination a lot better and unique ideas a lot better. And Bahamut is a very bog standard kind of end of year adventure in the Binding Coil fight, but still really well done. So not a lot to learn. It would stand as a pretty reasonable boss now, but they would probably have to do a few more complicated things to make this an actually engaging boss now compared to the other bosses in the rest of the final coil. And with that, we've now covered all of our A Realm Reborn raid retrospectives, at least for the 8-man. I don't remember if I did a 24-man raid. I think I did a 24-man ranking of some kind at some point. Maybe we need to revisit some of that stuff. My other retro videos are things that I very much enjoy. I actually want to do some retro videos on some other stuff. So I want to talk about the history of certain features in the game and how they have or haven't been updated throughout the expansions. And I think that could be a lot of fun. I love revisiting the history of the last, 11, 12 years at this point. Almost 12. Yeah. Wow. Oof. I don't feel old at all. And presenting that to you guys, and you all have been asking me, where's the retros, where's that? So I really want to make sure I can keep bringing those to you. Anyway, thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I will see all of you in the next retrospective. We do have the Alexander raid retros coming up, so keep an eye out for those. Anyway, I'll see you in the next one, and until then, take care.